Steve, how's it going?
I'm well, my friend, and yourself?
Just busy, but that's good because they say that it's supposed to keep you out of trouble, although that's not what I find, right? Usually the the busier I get, just the more hornets nests I seem to kick up.
That yeah, especially in this world, it's a minefield, in the podcast world, and just trying to be somebody who's trying to be f fair to everybody and unbiased. Still, sometimes things blow up, and you don't have any control over it, and you just got to learn to put things in God's hands because you can't do everything. So yeah, this can be a di difficult space to be in.
But it's a fun space to be in though, right? Especially
Yes.
today, right? Like I was thinking about that like just a few days ago, is that I'm not sure we've seen this much movement out of Mormonism in general, right? Across the board, from kind of the Brighamite branches on down to the reorganized groups. I think there's just a lot popping off, and it always seems like it's something.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that it seems like all the different restoration groups that I'm encountering are doing things they are anticipating things, and they're doing things differently than they had done in the past. For instance, you got the Biggertonites who up until 4 or 5 years ago were not engaging any of the groups in the restoration, but then they received a word from the Lord, a revelation saying they need to start engaging other restoration groups as well as other Christian group, outside of the restoration. And then that kind of stemmed, I come into their space. The very first restoration group that I ever attend their service is there. And essentially that's kind of happened with that group. And then you see the Snufferite movement who are in the stages of coming closer and closer to building a temple. And I just remember asking Denver, I said, if you guys build your temple, should we start anticipating the return of Christ? And he says, yeah. And then you have your group in Missouri or Missouri, depending on where you're at, which has done an unprecedented thing in the fundamentalist world, in which you guys have uh, built a temple and dedicated it for the service of all those who believe in the principle or who believe in Mormonism in general, and it's open to everyone. And your group is unique that you don't have a one-man leader. It's done by committee. It's a cooperative. And you guys built a temple that looks like something that was built by the Utah branch, by the Brighamite Church, but it actually was built by your group. And it's an impressive structure that you have built, and it was all done by volunteers and donations, much like the Kirtland Temple. So it seems reflective of that. Then you have all this interesting stuff going on in Independence, Missouri, where you
Yep.
have a lot of people moving there from all different branches. You have uh, you have a lot of cross pollination between my world, the Pentecostal world, in the charismatic world, and uh, the restoration groups there in Independence. Because I always tell people, so what's so fascinating about Independence is that it's it's the restoration right in the middle of in the right in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, right? It's right there. So you have this interesting convergence of people who are not necessarily believers in the restoration, but might be believers in the Book of Mormon or are accepting of people who are believers in the Book of Mormon. And so you have that kind of stuff happening. So yes, I see, and being somebody who's kind of an outsider observing, I'm able to see all these different moves happening, and I thought there's something going on. And I'm sure I could, well, look, the community of Christ, they sold they sold their birthright. Everything that made them unique in the sense that they were part of the restoration, they have essentially, in my mind, in some ways, have made a clean break with the restoration
Hmm.
and seem to be heading in the direction of just becoming a mainline Protestant denomination. And who knows if 10 years from now, there will even be a church called the Community of Christ. Perhaps they'll just merge with the United Methodist Church or something like that. That's speculation on my part. But it just seems to be like that they're just unprecedented changes and moves have been happening. We also know that a lot of interesting things have happening with the main church, the largest church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It looks to me like that church is going through a transition. Of course, they've made temple changes. they've embraced almost in one sense Holy Week for Easter in a way
Yeah.
that wasn't before. Um, they've switched off the Moroni um, tag for their locations for their wards and chapels and to replace it with a cross. So many things are happening just in the last few years that are unprecedented, I think, for most of these groups and very interesting.
It's fascinating too, because as I watch this and I watch all this play out, it seems to me like the restoration as a whole is going through some things and there's a reordering almost that's happening, right? And everybody now is kind of, I don't want to say picking a side, but maybe finding their niche, right? In whatever it's going to look like. And I can't help but wonder what it was that really prompted all of this, because it all comes about at roughly the same time, right? And that's the
Yeah.
other thing, is that it all comes about at the same time, which is very curious to look at.
So, and let's not also, be remiss to ignore this growing movement of people who say that Joseph Smith did not practice polygamy, the
Right.
monogamy terms, right? And that's become a thing. I mean, just look at the Gospel Text essay that was just released this week. It was a direct response to that movement. And you know what's so fascinating, Dave? I think that a lot of this, when I talk to so many people just entering into this space after COVID, um, but I think everything seemed to really change for a lot of people in 2020.
Yep.
And and it was the vaccine thing in which the church basically was saying you need to get vaccinated, and a lot of people pushed back. And for the first time, you've had schism in the past, but typically was from more progressive, where people would question the brethren, right? It
Right.
was more of a progressive left-wing thing. For the first time, you had people on the right, the more orthodox TBM community, starting to question the brethren. And that's never happened before. And that really opened up a can of worms. And I'm telling you right now, there are a lot of people in the ex-Mormon community that will tell you, and they won't tell you publicly, but they'll tell me privately that what did it for them was the vaccine thing, and that's what let them out of the church. But they don't want to be accused of being an anti-vaxxer or something like that in that community, so they don't bring that up. But some of the biggest high-profile people that have left the church over the last few years, it was also the vaccine thing that made them question things as well. It caused them to say, I need to start looking into things like why do I believe what I believe? Why do I have all this faith in the brethren if they're telling me something that I disagree with? How do I handle that? And so people just had different conversations that they never had before. So I think really that was the impetus for a lot of people to kind of reassess what they believe and what their relationship was with the church.
It's fascinating in that regard too, and I agree with you. As I think this has been a slow buildup, right? I think this has been something that has been taken a while to build up, and I think now we're at a tipping point. Um, and I think that it really started about the time the internet becomes ubiquitous, right? Because I think for whether you want to look at it as lies or whether you want to look at it more as trying to condense the narrative, the church for a while, the big Brighamite church was able to, shouldn't say Brighamite, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, they were able to pretty much craft a narrative, and because people didn't have access to the vaults, or they just didn't have time because they were raising six kids and got their church callings and jobs and all this, that history was largely unavailable.
Mhm.
Right? You did have Gerald and Sandra Tanner out there who were publishing some of these older things, but they were instructed to stay away from those folks because they were anti-Mormon. Well, when the internet comes along, doesn't take long, and we're starting to get to a point where there's no more secrets, right? And so all these things that I think the LDS Church took for granted that they could just own the narrative on, well, that's not the case anymore. And now, and so people started to see that inconsistency, and it just kept building and building and building. And you're right. In 2020, I think that was That was the thing that set most of this in motion. Because I think a couple things happened, right? All of a sudden, I think during the lockdown, I think there were a lot of people that went, wait a second, maybe the LDS Church does not have the monopoly on Mormonism.
Right.
Perhaps, perhaps this can be done in more than one way. And I think that really was kind of the undoing. And all of a sudden the questions that nobody wanted to ask are
Hmm.
is now public, right? And I certainly saw that when I first started the podcast. Like I honestly thought that the podcast was predominantly for fundamentalists. Well, that's not the case anymore. Mine seems to be, I got a big healthy percentage that's active members of the church, and they're asking questions and they're unsettled. And I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I think the genie's out of the bottle on that.
And to piggyback on what you're saying is that I think that the rise of, the ubiquitous information that's out there on the internet has been there for a while. But I'll relay a story to you. I think what happened was during COVID, people had time to start researching and looking at these things. And a perfect example is actually right here. Is I was on one of my trips to Utah. On my way back, I was sitting in the back row next to a Southwest Airlines pilot. And I've probably told you the story off camera, but I'll tell it on camera. Is this pilot was sitting next to me, and I told him what I do, and he said, "Yeah, I used to be a Latter-day Saint." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And he said, "Yeah." But then COVID happened, and I had a lot of time on my hands, so I picked up the first volume of Saints, and I read through it, and I was out. He had been so exposed to such a whitewashed history, a very correlated history, that he probably only knew about Mormon history based on what he was hearing in his ward. That when he was exposed to some church approved historical materials, it was enough to cause him to question everything, have his shelf break, and leave the church. And I think the church definitely recognizes this and realizes that we need to inoculate people, especially the youth, and that's why I think that's part of the reason I was invited to go on Saints Unscripted, the LDS Youth channel. It was kind of the church saying you can learn about the history of your church from Steve's channel to the LDS Youth, and so I think that they want people to be exposed to everything that's being talked about in Mormon stories. I have many of the same guests on Mormon stories that a typical Latter-day Saint wouldn't watch, but they'll watch it on my program. And again, I'm not here to weaponize Mormon history against any church, any movement. I just tell people as a Latter-day Saint, it's your birthright to know the history of your church. And I think that there's so many great sources out there, and to not know anything about all the other branches of the restoration that are really, I think, important in many ways and have made contributions. I'm trying to open up the dialogue so we can get all these different branches and get together. And I will tell you that there are many people who have gotten involved in other branches of the restoration as a result of being exposed to these ideas on my program. And so that's what we try to do is just be a safe space for everybody. I'm respectful for where people are at. I don't try to proselytize. I don't try to get people to go into a church or leave a church. I just want to be somebody that they can listen, that I will listen to and hear their stories. Sometimes the story will be told on my channel. Often it will just be behind the scenes. And that's kind of the ministry aspect of this too, because there's a lot of people who, when they're exposed to a lot of things they hadn't heard before, sometimes feel betrayed and they're
Yeah.
very hurt and they need a place to go, like, my shelf is really heavy, or my shelf is broke, or I don't even know if I believe in God anymore. And it's
Yep.
like there's so much of that stuff going on that I feel like that's part of the ministry here, is to let people say you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's no institution really that can get in between you and your relationship with the Savior. That's really what's the most important thing. And how you choose to worship God and what building you go to on Sunday or Saturday or whatever, that's between you and God. And don't let anybody else get in the way of that. And so that's kind of the approach that I take. So I'm just judgment free on people. However, somebody chooses to encounter the divine is that's their prerogative. So, like, I'm friends with people like you who are polygamous, and then but an hour from now, maybe, or a couple hours from now, maybe I'm on the phone with somebody who's part of the polygamy affirmer group, right? And both would feel that they're being treated fairly in this space. And that's what I strive for because I just want to listen and I want to learn.
No, you're right. And that's the thing that got me too, especially when I was about 2 years into this thing. I really noticed that the tones of the emails changed from the LDS side of things, right?
Hmm.
When I first started, it was more I think for whatever reason, people felt like, okay, I can probably talk to this guy, right? If I need some answers on things. Well, I'll give you an example.
Oh, okay.
When I first started the podcast, it was like weeks before the series Under the Banner of Heaven came out,
Okay.
right? And then all of a sudden it pops up on the scene, and I'm, literally 6 weeks into it, and I'm like, uh-oh, I gotta contend with this.
Hmm.
And so I actually do an episode on it. It was a good episode, I felt like. And I had a young couple reach out to me from the LDS church. The the husband had served a mission, went to BYU, found his wife, they got married, they had two little kids, and I had just gotten home from a trip and I checked my email, and this young father basically just spills, says, I don't know if I can be a Mormon anymore, right?
Mm.
And I was like, well, let's see what's going on. And so I message him back, and then we have a phone call. And he basically says, I watched it, Under the Banner of Heaven, and I don't recognize that gospel, right? I
Mm.
don't recognize that Mormonism. And I said, okay, what's the one that's hurting you the most here?
Mm.
And he said, well, it's blood atonement. I said, okay, let me go dig up some records here. Let me look at some stuff and let me get back with you. So we got back. I got back to him, and I basically, found all the documents, found all the instances I could find where it was both done kind of as Brigham had said, and then those who took it and ran with it without really knowing what it was about. When you break it all down, it's essentially capital punishment inside of a theocracy, right? And so as we show this, he's like, okay, I think I'm okay. And he goes back to church. And I get an email a few weeks later. He says, hey, everything is going great. I appreciate your help. And P.S. My bishop says thank you too. And
Hmm.
that was kind of it, right? And so at the beginning, it was a lot of that. Like, I don't understand this. I don't recognize this. Can you give me some documents that can help me put this in the framework of the restoration? Then it went to like, what are the brethren doing at the top, right? Questioning, anxiety. And this last go round with the 1886 revelation, people are pissed now
Hmm.
because you got the receipts, right?
Yeah.
There's no doubt what happened. You absolutely had the receipts. And that has caused the tones of the emails have changed at this point.
Hmm.
And I'm both nervous and excited. Um I think the ramifications of this are just now beginning to come out.
And I think also, of course, you came on a panel discussion recently in which we talked about the Heavenly Mother's comment, and you had the 1886 revelation being by the church, which in the 1930s they were saying it was a pretended revelation. Now in the catalog it says 1886 revelation of John Taylor, right?
Right.
So now it's an acknowledgement that yes, he did have a revelation about this being an eternal principle. And to me, it's almost like, if this is something, and let's not beat around the bush. This was about polygamy, okay? And to be very explicit about this, people understood what this revelation at the time was. And so for people to be exposed to these ideas, they would be, some of them felt convicted to continue the principle no matter what. And then Anthony Ivins was in the Mexican temple telling them that no matter what happens stateside, you continue this, you keep it going, okay? So they had, uh, you know, apostolic permission, if you will, or commands to
Commission.
yeah, and to do this. And so to push the polygamists and fundamentalists to the side and make them out to be these freaks when in many ways they were just following the prophet and and they're continuing with an eternal principle. And
And
so,
yeah, I think you're 100% right. And I think to go along with that, it's not, I mean, the revelation itself is about plural marriage. There's no doubt, right? Like you were saying. But what are really the implications for today? Why does it matter today?
hmm,
Well, I think it has to do with power, to be honest with you. Because all of the sudden, from outside of the structure, well, from inside the structure, you now have the man at the top essentially authorize and commission a group to operate outside the church.
mhm,
And when you do that, you have now remo- removed a portion of the power that was centered in that office, and it now is free on the outside to do what it needs to do. And I think that's where I think a lot of the rub comes in. It's not necessarily about plural marriage, right? The validity of the doctrine itself. It's more about the power structure and what this revelation says about that power.
hmm, hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. And of course, we do see the church evolve during this period of time. They become a corporation in the 1920s. They enforce the word of wisdom in a way that they never had before. Um, you have well, then around this time, then they removed the lectures on faith from the
Yep.
canon.
Yep.
So so in many ways, you see this church transitioning and going in a different direction, and then it really uh, the becomes um, formalized in many ways with David O. McKay, where he says, "Okay, we are going to mainstream ourselves. We're going to become Protestant middle class church. So, guys, shave off your beards. We're going to be presentable to uh, polite society, and we're going to take a lot of these kooky doctrines, if you will, that are being taught in different, various words, and we're going to basically correlate everything and just kind of whitewash our history so that it becomes more palatable and acceptable to mainstream Protestant America." And so that's what happens. And so you have like a further break from 19th century Mormonism in attempts to become a 20th century church. And it seems to be now even more so in the 21st century, you're seeing this transition where they want to become more and more mainstream and shed a lot of the baggage, if you will, that how they would look at it, that's keeping them from being accepted by other Christian groups. And they'll say, "Hi, we're being discriminated against because we're Mormon and we're Christian and we're this and that." But then at the same time, they're doing to you in many ways much worse than anything the evangelicals had done to the Mormon Church in the 21st century, in the 20th and 21st century. And they treat you guys. I mean, they were cracking down on you guys in the 1950s, dividing families. You guys were the main church was the most anti-polygamous group in the country, and so they persecuted you guys in a way that evangelicals never did, and so on some level. So it's so funny how on one hand they want to be accepted by we're Christians just like you, and then they treat you guys so horribly in my mind, and like they're just embarrassed by the mere fact that you guys exist. And I will tell you, I had a conversation. We've talked about this on the phone where I was talking to an individual, and I'm not going to give too much information here, but recently I had a conversation with an individual who we were just talking, and she was asking me questions about my podcast, and she's just regular LDS, you know. And we were talking, and and she said, "Yeah, I had a grandfather who practiced polygamy." I'm like, "Oh, really?" And she said, "Yeah, an angel appeared to him, told him to practice polygamy." I'm like, "Huh." I said, "Did he like start a group? Did he, you know, is he known?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, yeah." She said his name's Rulon Alred. I'm like, "Oh, wow." And then she's like, "But our side of the family has nothing to do with him." And I was like, "Oh, that's really interesting." And then I told her, I said, "You know, I've had one of Rulon Alred's granddaughters come on my program um, and give a presentation about Rulon Alred. And let me tell you, Real Knowledge was probably one of the most ethical, decent, moral men that I've ever encountered within the Restoration. There was nobody said one bad, harsh word against him. He was well regarded in the community, and there was no abuse going on in that church when he was the prophet. And I said he's just like Ogden Kraut. I said a real man of integrity who I've really learned to respect as a result. And she looks at me and she says, "That's the first time I've ever heard somebody say a nice thing about my grandfather. I'm so glad to hear this story." And I thought to myself, how sad
Yeah.
that their family was torn apart and and she never got to know her grandfather and find out that yeah, he actually was a pretty good guy. And
Yep.
the demonization that was going on about him was not true. And you could tell it touched her that she realized that, oh, my grandfather wasn't the monster that it was portrayed to me to be.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And I've rehearsed a similar story on my podcast with an email that I got. Very similar. Name wasn't as recognizable, but still pretty much the same thing. And that's the sad part, right? Because there's sometimes where I kind of have a holy envy of Catholicism, right?
Hmm.
Because at least in Catholicism, even though there's massive disagreement, there's a whole bunch of different orders, there's a whole bunch of different
Hmm.
angles and that sort of thing, and they figured it out and they made it work, right?
Yep.
Um, Sometimes I wonder if we couldn't have done that as a people, right? Just been like, okay, every Friday it's Fun Day Friday at the temple, right? And they're going to use this liturgy, and so if this offends you, don't go there. Um,
Hmm.
but it just didn't break that way. But no, it
Yeah.
is. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna, I sometimes I've even told people, I said, you really need to realize the how important it is to not try to go so far in one direction or the other.
Mhm.
And I said, if you strictly just want to be conservative and orthodox and push out the progressives or vice versa, you're actually doing damage to the church. I like the idea of a Catholic church in which you can be Gary Wills, who very is a member of the Catholic Church, but very, very critical. And he wrote a book called Papal Sin like 20 years ago. He was never excommunicated from the church. And he
Right.
was coming from a progressive Catholic view. And I thought that's we need more of that. I think this need to try to excommunicate and push out people with different views is this actually a sign of immaturity. This used to be very prevalent in Protestant churches too. Even my mom growing up at the Christian Reformed Church, it wasn't uncommon for them to announce who's been excommunicated this week, right? Kind of similarly to what the church has done. A lot of churches have moved away from that because they have recognized that the process of excommunication should be extremely rare and in just very unique circumstances and should not be applied uh, a lot. And it should be a very something of a last resort. And so the Catholic Church still does excommunicate people, but you have to do something so bad that it just requires it. And I would rather that be the position because I think if professors are afraid of what they're going to say in their classrooms at BYU, because they could have a meeting with their bishop and they could lose their Tepelarchamen and they could therefore lose their job. I think that's a little too oppressive. And I think and I think ideas, especially on campuses, ideas need to be put out there. And even if a professor says something that you might disagree with, rather have that space where they can say things like that rather than look, I've had professors off the record tell me I've had to self-censor what I say in my classroom because I'm afraid I'll get reported. And that I just don't like that. I like free exchange of ideas. I like the idea of having challenge students. And if they can't do that anymore, then I feel that the institution is just going to become another um, kind of like a Liberty University or a Bob Jones University, where orthodoxy is more important than anything. I think orthodoxy is important, but I also think having ideas to kind of push back and challenge students is also a necessary place in an institution of higher learning.
I don't have a problem with a private university towing a line, right?
It's
But
and
I
that's
think
their
it's
right. That's their
right.
right to. Yep.
Yep, yep. And so I don't necessarily have a problem with that. But I will say this, right? I do think that it somewhat defeats the purpose of a university experience, right? I
Mhm.
know I had I had a son, and this was when I was still in the LDS church, who wanted to go to BYU. And we talked about it. And I said, look, if you're gonna go to college, right? You're gonna go to a major university. Go to the University of Utah. Go to Utah State. Go to a different college. And when we had the discussion, and he asked me why, I said, this should be a time where you're challenged on what you believe,
Mhm.
right? And this is a I think it's healthy from time to time to have your back against the wall, not physically, of course, not physical violence, but theologically speaking, have your back against the wall and be forced to defend what it is you believe. I don't think that there's any damage in that. And so I feel like that BYU has every right to do what they're doing,
Mhm.
but I think it's not really doing what we'd hoped. So
Yeah.
I think you can skirt that line. It's just a matter of finding the balance.
Hmm.
Um, I do think having your beliefs challenged is in general a good thing. It forces you to reevaluate. But so, dude, you've done quite a few podcasts now. You've talked to a lot of different people. But how'd you find yourself in the space? You're an evangelical, right?
Yeah. Well, and I would say, a deconstructed one. I went through a deconstruction process myself. I was an atheist for about 13 years, and I've had an interesting journey. But one thing is I've just always had a real interest in general. I've just always been like a history buff. I've also just really been fascinated by religion in general. And so like for years, you had every few years there would be this edition called the Handbook of US Denominations. And it would be a book detailing every single denomination in the United States. And it would include Latter-day Saint Church and probably the Community of Christ. I don't think much more than those two. And and, and so I would just that would be my reading. I'd just read about all these different churches. And I'd go through and read, and I could never find a single church that I could have like, okay, this is a church that believes just what I believe. Like I was always looking for that church. So actually, as a result, I don't personally believe in church membership, so I've never been a member of a church. I've attended churches and church services, and I attend a church here in Sarasota. But and actually, I even asked my pastor, what about church membership? He's like, oh, we don't believe in church membership. I said, okay, good. I think I found a home here. But I've always been interested in all these different religions, and for a while, I kind of studied a lot about the Jehovah's Witnesses because I had some ex-Jehovah's Witness friends that I used to hang out with. Studied that pretty thoroughly, and he even told me, he says the only way you could know more about Jehovah's Witnesses is if you were a member yourself. And in many ways, probably knew more than most Jehovah's Witnesses because they were only exposed to a slice of their
Right.
history as well. And so I've studied all these different religions, but it was in particular the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Restoration in general that kept pulling me back in. It was such a fascinating thing. It's like this rabbit hole. You can't look, I give me 15 minutes on Scientology. I can tell you right. That's all I need. But to know what Scientology is really all about. Mormonism, you'll never ever have it figured out. You'll once you think you've got it figured out, some new bit of information will come out that is a paradigm shifter. I tell people, I said there are attics in Independence, Missouri, where there's items in those attics that could change the course of Mormon history. I even had a bishop go to me and say, "Why do you spend so much time talking to these other groups? Wake up, 99%. Why do you spend so much time with these groups?" For that reason, there's a for that reason there is that last year John Hychek came on my program. He's a strayingite, one of those small groups that I shouldn't be paying attention to. And I break the story through with John Hychek coming on my platform, breaking one of the biggest stories in the history of the Restoration, the sale of the Kirtland Temple. I was the first person to come out, released before anybody else had it out there. So that's why, because I want the next thing, big story to come through MBR as well, because of the relationships and trust that I'm cultivating with these other groups. I treat them with equal respect. So like Prophet Shiloh, I'm going to treat him the same way as I would a general authority, or I would with Matthew Gill, or with Denver Snuffer. I don't, I feel like everybody's making similar claims to Joseph Smith, and I can't just go and say, well, I accept this claim that Joseph's made, but I'm not going to those claims. Like, well, I'm going to treat them the same, and I'm going to treat like I can't interview Joseph Smith, but I can interview Matthew Gill, who claims
Right.
to have had plates and a Urim and Thummim that he translated with. Okay, well, let's talk about that. What was the translation process like? All these kind of things. That's what interests me is that there's so many different voices and different perspectives that we can get in here, and all of them claim that their church was founded on April 6, 1830, and they are the true successor of that church on some level.
Right.
So they all have that commonality as well. And I also think that the beautiful thing about Mormon history, and I kind of like to divvy it up a couple of things, is I tell people, I said, you can kind of see the what ifs of what would
Yeah.
have happened if our church had this direction by these different groups. So I call the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickertonites are the April 6, 1830 church. So I tell people, if you want to go to an April 6, 1830 service, visit the Bickertonites. I say the Temple Lot, Church of Christ Temple Lot, are the 1833 church. Why? Because they have the Book of Commandments and the Book of Mormon. And of course, the Bickertonites, they just have the Bible and the Book of Mormon. Okay. And then if you want to see an 1836 church, you could look at the RLDS tradition. Basically, Joseph Smith III said, when he was reorganizing the church, said, okay, we have disagreements here. We have Strangites, we have all these other people. Let's all agree that on April 6th, the 1836 temple dedication in Kirtland, let's go back to the beliefs of that church because we can all agree with that on that. And so that was kind of the organizing principle of the reorganization. Then, if you want to see what the 1844 church looks like, you could look at the Brighamite tradition, right? So, and that would include the fundamentalists as well, right? It wouldn't
Hmm.
just be the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you can then go see, okay, what would have been if it was just a Bible Book of Mormon church? That's the Bickertonites. What if it was just early days of this church? What if it was the Kirtland Temple as opposed to Nauvoo Temple rites? What would it look like? RLDS. And you can just see the different paths where they went and how they evolved. And it's so fascinating to be able to see this mapped out in actual churches that you can visit this Sunday and have those experiences and see the different compare and contrast the different theologies, the different beliefs, the different canons that they have, and just be able to say, wow, like the Bickertonites are so close to being an evangelical Protestant church. It's hardly I have to remind myself I'm in a Restoration church, or I don't have to remind myself. I'll be like, wow, this is like the church I grew up in. This is great. And then I hear the preacher say, and we expect the sealed portion to be revealed soon. I'm like, oh, that's right. I'm in a Restoration. I forgot for a second there. And so that to me is um fascinating. And I kind of break it down that way. And I uh kind of how I analyze the church history. And I think it's a good way to go about it. Kind of helps add clarification. And then of course we have other breakoffs and other groups and they're doing their own thing. And the restoration can be just as messy as Protestantism in so many ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What was it about his doctrine that drew you to it?
I think the original drawing in was the Book of Mormon itself. And I just remember as a little kid, and this would have been like maybe 9, 10 years old. I don't know. I just remember thinking we need another Bible because the Bible we have doesn't seem to be working anymore because people aren't following the Bible. It seems like it's out of date, and we almost need another Bible. And then I hear about this other young man who also had this encounter with these other scriptures, another Bible, if you will. And that was an intriguing thing to me. That's what makes Mormonism so unique is that, you have a lot of different groups come and go, but this guy had the audacity to produce new scripture in a world in which you didn't do that. That was verboten.
Yep.
And that was an audacious thing for him to do. And so I also think, so that's an interesting thing. And what was so interesting was that the Book of Mormon was, especially to a 19th century audience, um, was very relevant for the time because it seemed to address all of the modern day things that were happening, the doctrinal disputes, proper modes of baptism, all these different types of doctrines that they were talking about that were, like even Alexander Campbell said, that it seemed like the Book of Mormon addresses all of the current disputations of our day. Well, that was kind of the same mindset I had. It's like maybe we need another Bible to kind of clarify things and be relevant to a 20th century audience. And so that to me is probably the big thing for me is the Book of Mormon itself, um, and what the implications are of what does New Scripture look like. And is that is a type of theology because you asked specifically what kind of theology. Well, even as a kid, I recognized that when people would use the uh, the book of Revelation saying you should not add or subtract anything from this book. I knew early on that that was referencing the book of Revelation. It was not referencing the rest. So when other Christians would bring that verse up, I said that has nothing to do with it. I also come from um, kind of a charismatic Pentecostal tradition, which believes in modern day revelation, modern day apostles and prophets, right? But also and I never could understand why Protestants accepted that the canon was closed because that was
Hmm.
via the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent was the Counter-Reformation pushback on Protestantism. That's when the canon was closed, and the Protestants accepted that. And I'm like, I feel like that God could communicate to our world any way he wants. And if it includes new scripture, so be it. We don't have the right to say to God, no, we can't have no more scripture. A Bible. We already got a Bible.
Right.
No, I think that it's important that we realize that God can still communicate to us, I believe, through new scriptures. I think to limit God is to limit God, and I actually think that's blasphemous. So um, that's kind of how I approach the Book of Mormon. So that's and the theology, right? There's theological implications in the idea of an open canon, in the idea of having modern revelation, modern prophets, modern apostles. There's implications there, theological implications for both good and bad. We can see abuses that have taken place. We can see other pretenders who have claimed to translated plates or done stuff. We also see that some of them were very manipulative, evil people that have done harm. That's one of the downsides to the restoration. It's this idea that because we have this idea of an open canon and prophets and apostles that we've had throughout the years, people make these claims and literally, and not only within the Brighamite tradition, but even in the Josephite tradition in the 1980s, where you have these cults, these personality cults, and they often lead to murder and death
Yeah.
through a justification of Nephi with Laban. You know, that he was justified in killing him by the Holy Spirit. So they felt justified in doing that as well. So we also, and it's so fascinating because I love this book. A Pentecostal reads the Book of Mormon. Friend Christopher Thomas, who's the a step down, he was the founding president of the Book of Mormon Studies Association, and he has a chapter in this book about the misapplication of the Book of Mormon that has caused problems. Of course, we see the same thing happen in our world with the Bible as well. So it's not just
Sure.
a Mormon thing. So there's a danger. Also, we have to acknowledge that if you're willing to accept new scriptures, new revelations, apostles and prophets, that there are also outcomes that can happen as well. You've seen it in the fundamentalist world, and I've seen it in my world as well. So we should always be aware of the downfall or some of the dark side of our movements as well.
A lot of times, I feel like when you start parsing out Mormon history and Mormonism in general, you have to parse it out in a couple ways. You got to parse out the doctrine, then you need to parse out the history. And this is going to address some of that, right? Because people have asked, well, why do you put so much weight on what Joseph said? Right? Well, there's the doctrinal standpoint that I have, which is he's the dispensation head, right? He's the guy that God chose to talk to on this.
Mhm.
Um, but from a historical standpoint, right? If you want to measure fruit, if you will, right? Who's producing good fruit? What do I see from that time period in Mormonism with Joseph? I see a guy who is able to rally people, appeal to people's better nature in many instances, and managed to move people not just spiritually, but physically, right? Okay, now we're going to move to Kirtland. Now we're going to move to Illinois, right? And what's fascinating is that you get it with Joseph because Joseph is charismatic. He's loved by people, even people who don't agree with his theology.
Hmm.
You know, he's very affable,
Yeah.
and people rally to him. But what gets interesting is after he passes and Brigham Young picks up the mantle, Brigham is not Joseph Smith.
Mm-mm.
And to his credit, he doesn't try to be Joseph Smith.
Correct.
Brigham is his own man. But nonetheless, the same fruit seems to be apparent,
Okay.
right? And so as I start parsing out doctrine and look, Mormonism's interesting because you can't parse out the doctrine without the history. You got to have the
Yes.
context behind it.
Right.
And so when I start trying to parse out the doctrine and I start giving doctrinal weight to certain actors within the restoration, that's why I peg kind of set the bar at Joseph and Brigham and John Taylor because the same spirit, the same fruit is there with different leadership, which shows God's hand, in my opinion, behind it.
Hmm. Okay.
And it's
I
fascinating that you can't get that without the history on it.
I think, yeah, and that's so important. And of course, we have so many contemporary accounts. This is the beauty of the Restoration, is that we don't have this in the first century of the Christian church. We don't have Mormonism unveiled, written while Jesus' ministry is still going on, or Christianity unveiled, if you will.
Right.
So, so it's a different, like Fawn Brody said, the audacity to start a religion during the era of the printing press, right? And I think that there are so many things, and there's so many ways you can interpret it too. Like I'm partial. I mean, I'm very open to talking to other groups, and what's so interesting is about the saints who stayed back, who refused to participate in polygamy and join Brigham's church. They kind of look at it and say that's a different church. The Mormon Reformation, literally, they got baptized into a different church in their mind, and that they feel that their church is the original successor because they never got rebaptized. They
Right.
have the original baptism of the Josephite tradition, and so they feel like they've gone down a different direction, and so the church is it's so fascinating to see all these different groups, how they are influenced, but how so divergent. What was it? The Divergent Paths of the Restoration by Steve Shields, right? I mean, there's over 700 different groups, identified in this, and there's probably hundreds more that he's not aware of or have sprung out since he's written these books, maybe dozens more. But I think that for you, going down the Brighamite path and going down and accepting, polygamy as being an eternal principle, and that was originated with Joseph Smith. I can totally understand how you could see how Joseph, Brigham, and John Taylor all line up with each other, and that your movement is just continuing what this new dispensation was all about. And so I can see how you would understand yourselves as being really in spirit the true successors in many ways to Joseph in his mantle and his teachings on some level, right? I mean, your movement in general. So that's the other thing too is, what makes the restoration so difficult, especially when we're trying to get groups, and this is what I love about what you guys are doing in Missouri, is you have this one thing, this one true churchism, as I call it. We're the one true church. One of these groups claims to be the one true church, and it makes for dialogue that much more difficult as a result between these groups because it's like, well, you have to get rebaptized, don't recognize your priesthood. And so it makes it so there's so many barriers that don't exist. In my world, if you didn't like what the Wesley brothers were teaching at the Methodist Church, you just go down the street and go to the Presbyterian Church, no problem. But in your world, it's there are consequences if you
Yeah.
lead another group, even within the Restoration. I'm blabbering here, but I'm just kind of throwing a lot of stuff out here. But this is kind of stream of consciousness, if you will. But there's
No, it's good.
going on with the Restoration I find absolutely fascinating and compelling. And as an outsider, I'm like what is the true church? What church would Joseph recognize as his church? Right? How and what's so fascinating is like when I think this was a keen insight I was having dinner with Denver Snuffer, and he went to me and he said, if Joseph Smith came back today and became the prophet of the he said the church would be bankrupt within 5 years because he said he would just give so much away. Like that's just the way he was. He was a completely different person than what the church is today. It's a completely different way of operating. Well, I just being able to kind of try to understand the prophet and what the movement was all about. He was a rough and tumble kind of guy. The Ken doll image, the correlated Ken doll image the church has given us has a lot of people don't accept this photograph. And I tell people, even if this isn't a photo of Joseph Smith, he probably looked a lot more like this guy than the Ken doll image that the church has been promoting throughout the. So I think that once we realize that Joseph Smith was truly a human being, never in the movies is he ever even shown with a limp. I mean, he had a limp. He needed a cane. He probably looked a lot like this guy in this photo because he'd spent time in jail. He had been tarred and feathered. He'd been assaulted. He was on the run. That would age you real fast. And so I think that to best understand the restoration is to understand Joseph Smith, the man, and recognize that he was a man with flaws, but still that does not disqualify him from being a scripture producer or a prophet, because there are plenty of scoundrels who wrote scripture in the Bible as well. And I'm not saying Joseph's a scoundrel, but I'm saying is if the standard is the Bible writers, Joseph Smith in many ways was superior to them in many ways too. So in his morals, so that's kind of how I see it, and just kind of engage it that way. So either way, I'm sorry I blabbered on there.
Oh, no, you're good. That was excellent. Just to give you a heads up, it looks I'm getting a message here saying your bandwidth is low on your end.
Okay.
Um,
Am I coming through? Okay,
your
though.
your audio's great. Your video kind of freezes now and again, but
Okay.
we're
Yeah.
good.
Okay. Good. Yeah. As long as the audio's fine, I don't care if there's a few glitches or anything. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, to go along with that and go back to your original point about the nasty things that have happened within Mormonism, and look, we've got to acknowledge that, right? We have to say, look, we're not a perfect people. We have screwed up. We have made mistakes from time to time.
Hmm.
However, I do think a lot of that is because a lot of ideas weren't stress tested against especially Joseph, right? Like if you have an idea, you should be like, okay, how's this square with what Joseph taught? How's it square with what Brigham taught? I think you could avoid a lot of the heartache that we see if you stress tested the ideas, not only with revealed canon of scripture, but also with the things that Joseph and those early guys had to say. I think there's safety there.
Mm.
Um, you know, there, I'll just give you one in particular, and it's one that I use quite a bit, right? Where Joseph has a quote, and I'm paraphrasing, where he says, "Heaven will never intervene when there's an authorized representative on the earth," right? And well, you want to start parsing out all the guys who claim that they're the one mighty and strong. Okay, well, is the authority that is on the earth, did they receive it from there? No. Well, there's proper authority on the earth, so I can discount that, right? So
Mm.
you can prevent yourself from going down a lot of bad paths if you just understand what the dispensation had to say about a lot of this. Um, but unfortunately, that stuff gets tossed to the wind, and you're right, that is the precarious nature of saying, hey, God still talks to man, which I believe he does. But I
Mhm.
don't think that means it's a free for all, right? I do think that it is a house of order still. You just got to be able to parse that out and make sure that it's matching up with what the dispensation had to say about it.
You know, it's that's that I think discernment is really important. I think we need to remind ourselves, okay, not that long ago, Tim Ballard was claiming that Jesus appeared to him,
Yep.
that he wanted him to run for the United States Senate, and that he would be elected. And he was telling this to people. And it was out there. And shortly thereafter, and then not only was he making these claims, but he was not necessarily publicly, but we know that it's been leaked that he was making these claims. But at the same time, he's promoting his movie And he's getting all these people, all these Mormon podcasters are having him on the program. And I had a check in my spirit about the man. I was like, I don't know if I want him to come on my program because I think there's something not quite right here. Well, to see him go on all these programs with priesthood holders who
Hmm.
supposedly have discernment, I was like, why is it that I have better discernment on Tim than these priesthood holders? So that was kind of one of those moments because then later on, everything just explodes and it becomes this disaster. And I had friends who were very close to him who defended him to the very end until those affidavits came out, which were damning. Okay.
Yeah.
So we can even see not necessarily a person who claims to be a prophet or the one and mighty strong, but if those affidavits don't come out and those lawsuits aren't filed, we may very well have had a U.S. senator from Utah who believed that he was going to be essentially probably the president of the United States, and people had prophesied to him. Actually, I guess people also did say that he would also become the president of the United States and also would become the prophet of the church. So I guess in one sense he probably was kind of gunning for that a little bit. But that's just an example of a person who just a couple of years ago was huge, even in the evangelical world.
Right.
Had this big movie that was well promoted, and you had Glenn Beck on board. You had all these leaders, all excited. You had Tim Ballard meeting with the Quorum of the 12.
Yep.
Um, so it was all there. And now we know what we know about him. And so I think that's the danger of falling for a charismatic individual who people believe. And this is the most interesting thing about Dan Vogel's book, Charisma Under Pressure, his newest book about Joseph Smith. And this it really gives one of the key takeaways of this book was charisma is not necessarily the charisma that is exudes from the leader. It is the audience projecting the charisma onto the leader. And
Hmm.
and that and actually that makes a lot of sense. And so I think a lot of people projected a lot of things onto Tim Ballard and others, and that gives them even more power. So I think we just need to be cautious about these things. And again, for those of you who very few people are defending Tim Ballard anymore, even people who were defending Tim to the very bitter end have since moved away from this guy. I mean, I think he was a very dangerous man who needs to get some help, and we need to keep him in our prayers. But it's just an example of somebody who, if it wasn't for a few things, who knows where he'd be right now? He could be serving in the Senate right now. And so
Yes.
that's an important not only thing for the restoration, but also for Christians and people in general that we need to be very careful not to project too much onto the leader or this person who's going to be the savior of America, um, who's going to make this country great again, right? We need to be very careful that we don't fall into idolatry. And I think that's a dangerous thing that's happening in our nation as we speak. And by the way, it's not just Republicans. We saw Obama was a messianic character to a lot of
Yep.
Democrats when he first got elected too. So this is a natural human thing. I just think we have to be
Yep.
very careful that we have our priorities in the right place and remember that Christ is King, and we shouldn't look for other men to save us and
Right.
give us all the answers and everything like that.
You know, I that's always an interesting thing, right? When someone crops up and says, "Well, I'm the new man." I'm always like, well, one, if you're jockeying for that, I automatically distrust you because I am way too lazy to ever want that. So instantly you got my ears perked up, right? Like
Mhm.
I can't imagine someone that would want that. And
Yeah,
I think if someone does want that, I'm kind of like, yeah, you're probably a little bit of a psychopath, right? In
mhm.
Mormonism, for a while there was always this push about who's the one mighty and strong, right? And
Right.
my takeaway was, I certainly have my doctrinal positions on that, but I tend to say this: if someone has to tell you they're the one mighty and strong, they're not the one mighty and strong. And then to wrap this up, when you look at religious leaders, especially ones like Joseph Smith, you have to understand that it's a lot like looking at first round draft picks for quarterbacks, right? For every Peyton Manning you have, you're going to have seven or eight guys who just are busts. They
Oh,
wash out,
absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
And so for every Joseph Smith you find, you can bet that the vast majority of those that make similar claims aren't going to pan out as well, right? And you can in the world of religion, you can go down the list, right? Jim Jones, Koresh, just go down the list, right? And that does make the honest dealers and the dealers who have tapped into something that much more impressive because it didn't go ugly like that.
Hmm.
Because by
Yeah.
all accounts, Mormonism should have died with Joseph Smith.
Yes.
If it was all about charisma, it should have Joseph established something that was bigger than him. And that's hard
Yes.
to
That's so true because very few religions, if they're especially let's say very few cults make it past,
right.
in their original leader. And so that does say something to the staying power of the restoration. Also says something to the staying power of the Book of Mormon. There have been many pretended scriptures that have come out throughout the years that have come and gone that we forget about, we don't remember anymore. But there have been other, books that have been made claims about things. But in one sense, the Book of Mormon has kind of stood the test of time in a way those other scriptures haven't. So look, we're 200 years into this, and it doesn't appear to be going anywhere.
Mm-mm.
It's here to stay. And I think that we as outsiders need to try to find an accommodation for the restoration within the broader Christian community. I think that, I think we can't just exclude them, understanding fully that it's a non-creedal movement. It's typically non-Trinitarian. So there are issues that do separate it from Orthodox Christianity. But I also think at the same time, the demonization of the restoration needs to stop. And we need to just have better dialogue and more Christian civil discourse between our communities. Because when the world looks at this, they don't look at us. They say, well, look at those crazy Christians fighting each other, whether it's us Protestants fighting each other, or we're fighting the Catholics, or we're fighting you guys. Um, that just makes us look like we lack salt and light in the world. And what kind of testimony, what kind of testimony are we really presenting to the world if we can't get our act together and we just get in arguments and debates and say horrible things to each other? I think that needs to stop too.
No, I agree. I agree. I think that that we have enough of actual things that divide us that we don't need to invent more, right? And I think sometimes it has to do with misunderstanding. I do want to acknowledge something here, right? I think I'm a little different from most other Mormon podcasters who are still in the faith, so to speak, right?
Hmm.
I'm not sure that as Mormons we should be pining for that title of Christian, right? I
Fair
don't
enough.
think I
Fair
don't,
enough.
and that's not a slam on Christianity, Steve.
No,
I'm
no.
I don't want anyone to think it is. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is that there's enough
Hmm.
differences between the two that I think it's not intellectually honest to try to pine for that title.
So I think that's fair, especially the Bringhamite wing overall, because it is so different. I think you can make arguments that, the Church of Jesus Christ are pretty close to being
Sure.
Orthodox Christians. I think there would be accommodations in that church for somebody who might even accept the Trinity. The 1833 church, the Temple Lot, they're Trinitarian. The 1836 church is essentially become a mainline Protestant church. So all those groups are definitely more closer to mainstream Christianity than the Nauvoo era Bringhamite church. And so, which we need to acknowledge, Joseph Smith, it's not just Young's originated all this kind of stuff. Like, Joseph Smith played a hand in a lot of these doctrinal innovations, obviously. And it does, those later days, definitely do differentiate the Latter-day Saint movement, in particular, your movement, from the rest of Christianity. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. I just like to put in there that I look at the restoration as a whole. And so that it would include those other groups that maybe I think a case can be made they are Christian churches on some level, maybe small c, but that to me is an argument. But yeah, I certainly see that there are just look, idea of Heavenly Mother or mothers, those are foreign concepts. The idea of, you know, plural marriage on some level, although I have to say that there have been some Protestant communities that have experimented with the principle in the past, and so this has happened. This is not, that is a manifestation that it has occurred in our movement as well. Yeah, so there's enough different stuff there, but then at the same time, I can look at similarities
Sure.
between the charismatic movement, the modern charismatic Pentecostal movement, and your church. Okay, I always tell people, I say, in my movement, got a guy named Benny Hinn who believes in multiple Godhead. You have a guy named Kenneth Copeland who believes that we will become gods and also basically teaches a doctrine that it's basically Adam God doctrine. You have Pat Robertson who ran for president of the United States. Um, you had you have oh, who else? There's a couple more people. Well, in other words, we have these characters that all roll up into, oh, you have Jim Baker, who was a city builder,
Right.
right?
Right.
So I see all, it's like, oh, I know Joseph. I can see him. There's so many similarities with some of these really
Yeah.
important leaders. You know, you had Oral Roberts claim to have seen a 200-foot Jesus to talk to him. That seems even more implausible than the first vision, right? So like in my movement, it's like, oh, a lot of these little doctrines have found their way in some ways in our movement. You have the even the idea of tithing and it giving you blessings. You have the prosperity gospel. So you do find I can actually find a lot of different ideas that Joseph was the originator of, or the person who was kind of taking in from different places as well, have found their way in the charismatic movement, interestingly enough.
Oh, that's interesting. It's almost like, well, you can have the title of Christian as long as you don't have all the crazy beliefs in one guy, right? You can
Right.
have some of the different beliefs spread out
Yeah.
amongst different guys, and it's fine, but you
Yeah.
got to choose one, right?
Yeah.
But that is an interesting point, though, right? Because all the things that we see, like you just laid out, which look, I'll be honest, I was unaware of some of them. Um, but you start looking at some of that and you're like, oh, well, that happened like 200 years ago except it was one guy, right?
Hmm.
Again, it's one of those things like, well, maybe he was ahead of his time, right?
Yeah.
And that's interesting too. So let me ask you this. You occupy an interesting space because, so to speak, you don't have a dog in the fight, right?
Right.
You're removed from the theological aspect of things, which can work some folks up, which has got to give you a different lens in which to view the landscape of Mormonism.
Hmm.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question, and if you're uncomfortable answering it, you don't have to. But I'm interested on your take here. When you look at the restoration as a whole, what do you think is coming in the near future for it?
Boy, that's such an interesting question. So I think in the near future, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints will continue its conservative Orthodox uh, entrenchment. It will continue to double down on the more conservative aspects. It's very similar to what happened in the 70s and 80s with the Southern Baptist Convention, the Missouri Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and the evangelical movement in general. Well, had this real hard swing to the right, in which they basically got rid of all the progressives out of their theological institutions and colleges and replaced them with Orthodox conservatives, which is what we're seeing in the bringing. So they're using the same playbook that evangelicals were using back in the day. The church is following a very similar pattern. I think that, and that's just one aspect. I think that the community of Christ, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's based on a well-informed opinion and based on my conversations with multiple people and sources, including in the church. I don't know if that church is going to be around 10 years from now. I don't know. I have reports that they're expecting in some regions to close 80% of their congregations within the next 5 years, which it's plausible that I thought maybe 100 years from now, but it's plausible that within the next 10 to 15 years, the Bickertonites might be the second largest church in the Restoration, um, over the Community of Christ, which is just mind blowing to think about. I think that the Bickertonites, there is a move going on there that I think is pretty remarkable. I attended their general conference, and there was multiple instances of tongue speech. There were revelations, there were visions. I saw in my mind, I'm like, man, this feels very much like early days. Early, and what was so interesting is they actually had a conference here at my Christian community, a regional conference, and I took my mom and my 101-year-old prophetess missionary friend Yanni, who was involved in the early days of the charismatic movement, including my mom was too. She attended their service and she said, Steve, this is like the early days of our movement. And so to be able to have the privilege to attend their general conference and engage the people, there was a power there that was remarkable. And I have to tell you that I can, and I'll just be honest with you, the very first church in Restoration that I ever darkened the door of was that church. They have a congregation about 90 minutes away from here. I thought this would be a good starting point. And this is early days of my channel. My channel had been around for a couple months. And I walk in there, and I have to say, it really struck me. And I felt the Holy Spirit, and I felt the anointing, if you will. And my mom's even claimed, she's also said she's felt the anointing in those services as well. And it changed me, and it changed my channel. And then what was so interesting is a couple weeks later, the God told me, he's like, you need to go to the Mormon History Association. I wasn't going to go, but after I attended that service, I had $1,500 saved to get new rims for my car. And instead, I chose to invest that money into my channel so that I could attend the Mormon History Association. It was a direct result of God saying, I kept on, because God told me not to make any plans, and I kept on pushing back. Rick Bennett was getting on me. Go to MHA, go to MHA. He's like, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. I can't do it. Well, after I attended that service, it's like, oh, okay, I got confirmation I'm supposed to attend MHA. And that changed the trajectory of my channel because that of course gets me to book Richard Bushman, which then causes a lot of people to say, hey, wait, who is this guy? Bushman hasn't done a podcast in years. So I think the hand of God was in that. But then I go and attend Rick Bennett's church in Lehigh, and I love Rick Bennett, and I really do. But I go to attend that service, and I was like, man, that is a doornail. These people could use a cup of coffee. So and and it was just such a different experience for me. And I'm really grateful that I got to attend that Bickertonite church because I saw there like, man, this there was a power there that I saw that I felt that the spirit was operational in a way that was unique and even more so. Look, even I'm saying the spirit was operating there that more than 9.9% of the church services I've attended in my life. So I'm not just isn't just a bash on any particular church. This is just I'm just I experienced what I experienced.
Sure.
So so I think that the Bickertonites are a movement that will continue to grow. And I think that they very well could be in the next 10, 20 years, become the second largest branch in Restoration. I think that, I tell people, because people go on to me and saying, like, look, I was kind of told, don't platform the polygamy deniers, as they are called. So don't platform them. And then as I studied it and looked into it, I realized, when they write the chapter for the early 21st century history of the Restoration movement, they're going to have a chapter about this group. And so to ignore that group was actually going against the idea of my channel, which is all the voices of the Restoration will be heard here. So
Right.
then I started engaging Michelle Brady Stone and others. And I felt like it wasn't fair that I kind of didn't engage them. And I'm glad that I did. And I'm glad I have a good relationship with those people. I think that's a movement that's going to continue on a different trajectory. I don't know. Could this ultimately lead to another church being started? I don't know. Um, I think Denver Snuffer and his movement are a fascinating group. I mean, they're making claims. Some people believe that Denver is the Davidic servant. I think it's really fascinating that one of Denver Snuffer's right-hand men Matthew Lohmeyer was recently appointed as the Undersecretary of the U.S. Air Force.
Hmm.
So if I was a follower of Denver Snuffer and I believe that the second coming is coming soon, and I have a very close associate of Denver Snuffers that has the ear of the most powerful man in the world, I would think that there's there within their belief system, things are coming to a head. I also think that what's so fascinating is just seeing all these movements, including your own, which in and of itself is remarkable, to have all these other fundamentalist groups coming together and being able to go through the original endowment ceremony. That's revelatory in some sense, and so it seems to indicate, it is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we're coming on the 200 anniversaries, both just that have passed and are coming, of some really important dates within the movement. So I think that there's a general anticipation that things are winding down, end of days, and it's coming. So what does the future look like for the restoration? Well, maybe the things wrapped up and the second coming is happening. And so then we're talking about millennium now. Or maybe the second coming doesn't, maybe it's not for another couple thousand years. So now we have to
Right.
look at, what does the restoration look like if we're still here 100 years from now, right? And
Right.
that's kind of where we have to look at it. Like, we have a church that is one of the most, wealthiest churches in the world that could go hundreds of years without accepting any tithe money and just work off the money that they have, stored up. So you have that. And so in and of itself, that church is not going anywhere. And so but there's other groups that probably won't make it 100 years from now. And I love the Community of Christ, but just seeing the direction it's going, and I hope I'm wrong. Prove me wrong, please do. I think you're an important voice, and I do appreciate the Community of Christ immensely. But I just seeing the trajectory of that church, and I'm very concerned about it. And there's many people in that church that are also very concerned about the trajectory of that church. So I hope I answered your question there, because I think it's I can't just talk about one church.
No, no, that's not what I'm
I think the
asking you to do.
restoration, the restoration as a whole is, but I do see that there seems to be this convergence of a belief that something is happening, that there's changes going on, that the sealed portion is about to be revealed, that maybe the choice seer. So um, within the Bickertonite tradition, they believe that there will be a choice seer named Joseph, who will be a Native American who will reveal new records. That's their anticipation. You have other groups that believe in a future one and mighty strong. Um, they're anticipating that. I've spoken to others who believe that Joseph Smith will return, or in one case, a person who says Joseph Smith already has returned.
Mhm.
So you have a lot of these different interpretations and all these things that are going on. And so I don't know. I think that we will continue to see the rise of the ex-Mormon movement. That will be around, that's here to stay. But I also think because you have had this large amount of people that have left the movement, in particular Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I think that the amount of people that will be leaving the church will be slowing down. So I think that it has lost some momentum, because what we have seen just overall throughout the world, there's been a pushback of the growth of atheism, and we actually are now seeing the pendulum swing, where now we're seeing an increase in church membership now throughout the world, in the Christian church in general, and we're seeing it even in church. So I think we're having a pushback against the new atheist movement, and so the churches are kind of putting out a counteroffensive that started happening, about 20 years ago with the rise of the atheists and stuff like that. And I also think that people realize the importance of having faith, and becoming a nihilistic atheist is dark, can be a very dark space to be in. And so they've sometimes and realize that in many cases, the ex-Mormon community in and of itself is its own religion. It has its own, well, really, it does. I mean,
It is. No, you're I laugh because I made that point on the podcast to somebody else.
well, you can be excommunicated from the ex-Mormon community. That's the crazy thing. Like, I mean, you can be canceled, excommunicated, but the difference is there's no, because it's primarily atheist, there's no redemption, there's no second chances. It's like once you're canceled, you're it. And I feel like so often there's a toxicity in that community. Look, I love the ex-Mormon community in many ways. I'm friends with many people in there. I'm not implicating. I totally understand why you would maybe take that path because I was an atheist for 13 years, so I ain't going to hate on atheists, I ain't going to hate on ex-Mormons. I understand that space you're in, but sometimes people occupy that space, that angry atheist phase for too long. I understand if you need to be the angry atheist for a while. I was too, but you got to from that too because it can do a lot of damage to your soul. Hatred I don't care what the hatred is directed towards. Hatred is still hatred, and it will do damage to your soul, period. So even if you hate Joseph Smith, even if you hate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and maybe you have good reasons to feel that way, you need to move on because you're doing damage to yourself. And hate is a very destructive thing. So I don't know. That's just an overview of a lot of different things.
No, no, that's excellent. I want to touch on a few things you said there. One is the idea that Jesus is coming back tomorrow, right?
Mhm.
I've always said this. You should live like that's exactly what's going to happen,
Yeah,
but you should also plan on planting your apple trees and that sort of thing, right? Because
absolutely.
I've called it playing pin the tail on the apocalypse, right?
Yes.
Too
Yes.
often that's a losing game, right? And I don't spend a lot of time now, let me rephrase this. I do think about it and I like talking about it, right? But keep that in the realm of ideas, right? Like I'm
I
always
agree
nervous
with you.
when someone says it's going to happen next year or five
Right.
years from now. I'm like, yeah, just relax on that.
That's the
How,
world I grew up in. That's the world I grew
yep,
up in.
yep,
Like, Late
absolutely.
Great Planet Earth was the top-selling book, period, of the 70s, and
Yeah,
basically was saying that Jesus was going to be coming in the year 1988. That's basically why, and that's why it became such a big seller. I grew up in the world in which the second coming was right around the corner. The idea that we'd even see the year 2000 was ridiculous. Like,
right.
there's no way we're going to make it to the year 2000. Like Jesus is going to come before that. So, yeah, I grew up in that world. So I've learned to be much more grounded on this whole thing,
Yes.
susceptible to looking for being a sign seeker or whatever. I'm more of one of those people that's like I'm observing. I've essentially moved into the post millennial camp myself. So
Gotcha.
I'm an optimistic post millennialist, if you will. So that doesn't really fit within the worldview of the restoration movement at all, because
Right.
you guys are premillennial. But I tend to be more comfortable in the partial preterist post-millennial space.
Right.
That's where I land in that category.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I so that's that for that. I believe the second coming will happen. I think all those events will take place, but I don't
Uh,
allow myself to spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about it. But back to where I think the restoration's heading, well, that question. I read an interesting article, I want to say just last month. And I should say this. I've changed my views a little bit on the younger generation.
okay.
Um, I was always like, just, because I come from a poor background, right? And managed to get myself out of poverty and those sorts of things. So I was always like, just work harder, right? You'll get there. Just put more elbow grease into it. I will say this. I think after looking at it, and it came from personal experience with a young man that I know back in Utah, and started looking at it, and yeah, the deck is kind of stacked against him a little bit, right? And but also I took a deeper look at why church attendance was down everywhere, right?
Hmm.
Not just Mormonism,
Yeah.
but everywhere. And as I started talking, because most of the guys I either work with or some of the guys that I hang out with, they're a little bit younger than I am. And what I was discovering is that they're not leaving church because they want to go do something different, right? They're leaving church because they don't feel like they're making an impact there, right? For
Mm.
this younger generation, they're very, they want to know whatever they're doing is contributing to the good of the society they're in. And I think what's going to happen to the restoration, especially those who aren't super organized, I think they're going to get a bump really soon because I think that younger generation wants to be involved in something that's bigger than them,
Hmm.
right? And if we look at what Joseph's original thrust was, he didn't care about churches, right? He built exactly zero just ward chapels or meeting houses. What he did build was communities and temples. And
Yeah.
that's a different view than a lot of other than a lot of the rest of Christianity. And that's not a slam. I'm just saying the view was different from Joseph's perspective.
Hmm.
And so I think that some of those youth, if we who look, I'm talking to fundamentalists, I'm talking to independents, right? Those if we can line up and have a positive impact on the community in which we reside, I think some of these other doctrines that we think might be a barrier to entry aren't necessarily a barrier to entry for the younger generation. They
Hmm.
just want to know that what they're doing is having a positive impact on the society in general.
Hmm.
And there is some danger in that, right? You got to be able to keep, because look, if you just throw all orthodoxy out the window, what are you left with? Well,
Right.
you're not really left with a church any longer. You're left with a social club, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you're going to have to walk a fine line there. But if we can do that and get out of the way and not be so concerned with hierarchy and start being more concerned with are we being the light on the hill that Christ asked us to be? I think things are good there. So I do think that as I look at it, I think the more hierarchical structures are going to suffer in the short term.
Hmm. Hmm.
I think those who are a little less organized, but maybe a little more service minded or trying to get back to the original message, I think those will flourish for a while.
I I think this is I call it DIY Mormonism or non-denominational Mormonism.
Yep.
I think that there's a rise of that, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's a growing movement as well. People that are just kind of doing their own type of Mormonism on an individual level. It's very Protestant, it's very evangelical, and
Right.
I've spoken to many people off the record who are basically non-denominational Mormons or just kind of doing their own thing, and that's a really fascinating facet of that. And so yeah, there's and let's not also ignore the fact that there is a rise of progressive Mormons that want to continue who like the Reform Mormonism movement, which Rob Rao Lauer is involved in. Of course, my friend Evan Charlie's involved. They're they're doing the endowment ceremony. They believe in the doctrines. In many ways, they probably are in line with you guys on doctrine and theology more so than the main church. Absolutely. And so I think it's really interesting, but it's a progressive take on it. It's a different manifestation of the restoration, but it is truly fascinating to essentially accept a lot of the 19th century doctrine as being part of their church, but kind of putting a 21st century twist on it, but still practicing a lot of the principles of the 19th century Mormonism. So it's just really kind of in my mind, it's kind of a cool experiment to see what's going on. But I also realize that I got to be I don't want to come across as an anthropologist who's just kind of standing here and watching things like, ooh, isn't this interesting? Ooh, isn't this exciting? Because I recognize like these are human beings, and this is about their faith, and this is what they believe, and this is what makes them who they are. So I have to be honoring and respecting of all these different views without trying to come across as some kind of outsider who thinks, oh, look at, oh, I'm just observing things and kind of apologists and kind of describing them. I'm like, no, I'm living it too. I'm attending the services. I'm praying with them. I'm fellowshipping with them, and I'm engaging with the restoration in a way that I think is so important. That if you're going to be the religious group. You can't just be an outsider. You need to be a participant on some level. And that's what I try to do. I consider that what I'm doing here is a sacred thing, having a conversation with you. I'm honored that you would have me on your program. And I'm
Mm.
honored about all the wonderful people that have been on my program because it's a sacred conversation that we're having. It's a very human conversation as well, but it's sacred because we're all image bearers. So anytime we're engaging each other as image bearers, it is a sacred moment, especially when we're talking about sacred things. And I think I think that's what, if you will, Heavenly Father wants for his children. Stopping the bicker tonight, not the bickering, not the bicker tonights, stopping the disputations And one of the words that I feel the Lord gave me was a couple years ago. I was speaking at the Book of Mormon rally in Independence, Missouri, and there were all different groups. And I remember standing there and I said, in the Book of Mormon, we have what is called what I call a proto-millennium, which we have this 200 years of peace. And one of
Mhm.
the key things that brought this about was one of the key verses was, and there were no more matter of ites. And then I'm
Right.
like, but I'm looking in this crowd and I see Brighamites, Josephites, Cutlerites, Strangites, Bickertonites, all these matter of ites. It's almost like it was a call to the restoration that if you believe in bringing forth Zion, if you believe in bringing forth the um, the millennium and all these kind of things, we got to get rid of all these ites. As long as there's ites, the restoration will not be ready for what they believe will be coming. And so I think that that's a key thing too. And I think the Book of Mormon even tells us it's a condemnation, if you will, on some level of the restoration, that we have all these matter of ites, when it makes it very clear in the Book of Mormon there can't be any more ites.
That's a tall order, right? Because as a guy who's
It
on
is.
the
It
inside
would-
of the community, if you were to do something like that, I think you all have to agree on a standard at some level, right? And look, let's be fair. A lot of those groups that maybe spring from Emma Smith, I don't know how else to put it, right? Um, I know my family wouldn't be welcome there,
Mm.
right? I mean, that's just what it
Well,
is.
It's it's
Um,
a it's a very uncomfortable conversations we're going to have to be, but I think it's time for the adults to start talking.
right,
I think that's really important. And I also think that if you believe the Book of Mormon and if you believe in the restoration, I think that it really it's a very compelling thing that it condemns ites, and yet there has been all these. And again, the whole idea of the restoration was we're going to get rid of the confusion. We're going to get rid of. We're going to
right.
have a standard. We're going to have, like, this church is a mess. That's why we need a restoration. And then I look at the restoration, and in 200 years, it's probably there are probably more sects of the restoration in the 200 years of the church than there were in the first 200 years of the Christian church.
Sure, sure.
So, and if it continues trajectory, will probably be even more so than Protestants and everything. So, I think that is when Ezra Taft Benson said the church is under condemnation and still is, I think there's something to that.
Sure. Sure. No, I think there's so many people that are so widely different in their theologies and their doctrines that it's hard to wrap everyone's mind around it, right? And it's an interesting thing that you did bring up earlier. What I tend to see in these different splits is everyone picks their favorite time period,
Yes.
right?
Yep. Precisely.
Just as you put it out there, right? Um, a lot of people don't like the Nauvoo period. Well, I'm sorry, it is a period of Joseph's life, right? And if a guy like myself, I tend to look at that and say Joseph during the Nauvoo period is probably operating at his highest point, right? He's been seasoned through experience. We know that line upon line, precept upon precept is a heavy thing in Mormonism when you start talking about progression.
Hmm.
Um, and so to just discard that is bad. Likewise, though, we can't just discard the lessons of Kirtland and the lessons of
Yeah.
Missouri and the lessons of Pennsylvania and New York, right? You have to understand that. And so that would be a tall order, if it can happen, I'm there for it. But it would be a tall order because you're either going to have a standard or you're going to have a lot of grace from person to person.
Yeah.
Which you know, I don't mind saying that a Bickertonite is part of the restoration. I disagree with some of their doctrine,
Hmm.
right? They would disagree with some of mine, and that's okay. I don't think we have to be enemies in that.
I
And
agree.
I think this also goes to what does unity really look like, right? I think sometimes we all have this idea of what unity is going to look like, but maybe it's not quite what we're thinking it is.
Mm.
Um, but I do want to that would be awesome to happen, but I do think I do think we have to acknowledge the doctrinal differences and figure out how to navigate those.
Certainly.
So, so what was it that, as you started the podcast, what were some of the challenges you first encountered?
Well, I think when I first started, it was interesting because my first interactions with the restoration when I was starting, before I started up my channel, was primarily people, independence-based saints. What had happened was I was going to launch my channel, and before I did, I actually participated in a weekly Zoom call with the Community of Christ that was book club that was doing a a we were reading the book Joseph Smith, the Third Pragmatic Prophet by Roger Launius, and um, we did a couple chapters each week, and I introduced myself, and that's when I first met Lachlan Mackay and Barbara Walden, who were with the history department in the church, and Lachlan, of course, being a direct descendant of Joseph and everything like that. And so I was like, wow, maybe this is where maybe I'm supposed to just be more like like encountering, the community of Christ, which and in that movement in general. And the people were just so lovely and engaging to me that I'll always feel I have a soft spot in my heart for the community of Christ. When I first started the channel, um, what was so interesting to me was that I had a couple dozen subscribers, and on John DeLynne's radar, like when I had like a couple dozen subscribers, we started communicating to each other. First places. I remember the first night I'm talking to John DeLynne on Reddit, and we were going back and forth. And I was like, oh my gosh, like I can't. I went to my mom the next morning and said, Mom, you wouldn't believe this. I was in communication with John. And I always tell people, imagine starting a podcast and you have a couple dozen subscribers and Joe Rogan is engaging you.
Right,
That's kind of right. In our space, he's the Joe Rogan, right?
right.
And then the next day I get a friend request from Sandra Tanner on Facebook. I'm like, whoa, how did I get on her radar screen, right? And so that's when I realized like, oh, there might be something special here. And and so it was like, okay, well, let's just continue. And my mom caught this on early on. So when I was a young man, I was a teenager, and I was really involved in politics during my younger years. And I was doing a house group fellowship, and I was giving a presentation about why Christians should get involved in politics. And there was a gentleman there who was the vice president of one of the banks in the community, and he was in the room as I gave my presentation. Now this is like pre-cell phone days in one sense, except he had one. I get a call. He leaves, and I'm still at the house, and he calls the house and says, "I want to talk to Steve." So he says, the Lord gave a word for you." And he said that the work you're going to do is like you're going to be a modern day Daniel. This is what he prophesied over me. And you'll have the ear of very powerful people. So at this time, we're like, and I told my parents about this, and like, so and so gave you that prophecy. And this is a very prominent individual in the community. But back then, a bank vice president was a big deal, And
Right.
and so I forgot about the prophecy. I got burned out of politics by the time I was in my mid 20s, run for office, did political consulting. I was like, man, I don't know if I can do this anymore. I get burned out, kind of move away from that period of my life. And it was early on, first couple months of this channel, and again, just dozens of subscribers, where my mom goes to me, she says, the prophecy is being fulfilled, Steve. We thought it was about politics, but the prophecy was about your role in this, in what you're supposed to do. And since then, I've had engagements with general authorities, uh, President Elder Anderson. We've had two great communications with each other. He's watched the channel. He's told me. His own son told me that he's watched my channel. So I can tell you, there's a member of the Quorum of the 12 who's aware of my channel and has watched it. But I've also had engagements with all these different leaders within the movement. And so I think on one level, um, people have, and again, this is where it gets really sensitive. And actually, I want to make it very clear to you, Dave. So less than a little over a year from the time I started my channel, I was a guest for a full week on Mormon Stories.
Hmm.
Well, a few times a guest has probably been given a full week on that platform. And one of the things I did was I went to John and I said, when I was a little kid, I went to a friend and said, and this is like third, fourth grade, I said I would make a great cult leader. I Yes, I recognize that as a child. Well, I specifically went and said that on Mormon Stories to serve as a guardrail so that I don't be tempted to become that cult leader. Because I can tell you that so many people, and I tell people, says if I was a person that was a malevolent person, I could take advantage of people. I've had people from just about every movement of the Restoration tell me, I believe that you're going to play a role in bringing forth Zion, telling that to me, an outsider. I had another person go to me, say, I believe that you might be Joseph Smith reincarnated. This person believes in multiple mortal probations. I've had all these different manifestations of the Restoration tell me this. If I wanted to become a prophet, I could, but I don't believe that that's my role. But I also recognize, again, the charisma, people projecting onto a person has happened to me firsthand, where people are projecting onto me something.
Sure.
So when somebody says, we believe you're going to bring forth the Zion, I don't know what that means, but they're projecting that onto me. So I've just, God told me early on, he said, you know, don't make any plans and just follow my lead. So that's always the guiding principle that I've been following. Early days, everything came easy. The last year and a half has been a real struggle for me. I believe I'm in my period trials that I'm going through. But it's humbled me and it's kept me, I think I'm glad that I've experienced what I've experienced over the last year and a half because I think I needed that. I think sometimes being a male, sometimes your ego can be stoked when people are saying all these things about you and you're having all these great guests on and people are telling you how wonderful you are. I think I needed to have some setbacks happen in my life as a reminder. See, the problem was is that Dave, last year, a little over a year ago, I started making plans. I had a lot of plans.
Mm.
I was going to be one of the keynote speakers at Rob Meldrum's conference. I was going to then fly out to speak at a Book of Mormon rally in Independence. I was like, wow, this is, and then I woke up one morning with loud screaming in my ear, and I realized that my life had changed because I lost almost all my hearing in my right ear, and it was replaced with a loud screaming of tinnitus, well, with hypoacusis, which means I'm sensitive to sound as well. And I was bedridden for like a month and a half last year. And I sat in bed thinking, God, I don't want it to end this way. Because I couldn't talk. I mean, mom and I would talk in whispers or we text each other because that's how bad it was. I couldn't walk outside because the sound of my neighbor. I couldn't sit in my living room because my neighbor's air conditioner would kick on. It would be too much for me and I had to go in my room. That's how bad it was. So I had a lot of time to think the things through. And I was like, okay, this is bad, but this isn't nearly as bad as my darkest times in my life. So that was a good thing. But I also realized, like, God, I started making plans and you told me not to. And so I feel like that was kind of like him telling me, Steve, I'm serious, don't make plans. And so that's kind of how I operate. So I try not to let this get to my head. I think maybe some of that was happening. And I started making plans and God humbled me. He literally brought me down to my knees.
Right. That's why that's sometimes people think I just ignore, and I don't necessarily ignore. But what I do is I never read the comments, right?
Yeah.
Because only two things are going to happen, right? One is you're going to get an ego boost. Nobody
Yeah.
needs that.
Yeah.
Nobody. Or someone's going to say something really stupid, and you're going to be like, okay. And you're going to get involved in a squabble that's going to make you look silly too. Just
Yeah.
post and ghost, bro.
Yeah.
Right? Because like you'll drive yourself nuts reading the comments, or
Yeah.
nothing good comes from that, right?
I just I do read the
Haters are gonna hate, and that's
yeah.
just all there is to it.
I, I do read the comments, but I don't let them affect me. And actually the few times I have engaged, especially like on Facebook or Reddit, it was like, man, I just wasted a lot of time here. I like
Yeah.
nothing good came out of this conversation. So I refuse to engage. And actually when people start getting nasty with me, I'm like, Here's a Zoom link. You can say it to my face. Are you man enough to say it to my face? It's the Zoom link
Right.
challenge. And the only person, and I've done this dozens of times, the only person that took me up on that offer was um, Chino Blanco, the founder of the ex-Mormon Reddit. And we went on a Zoom a couple years ago, 2, 3 years ago now, because he had some said some critical stuff to me. And we had a wonderful conversation. And last year, right before Sunstone, he came on my program to give an oral history of the ex-Mormon Reddit. And I think that's an important episode because people need to know, like, what was the early days like in this movement, and got to hear
Right.
from one of the early voices in this movement, and got a nice oral history of the early days of the ex-Mormon Reddit. And that's the only second interview he's ever given. He gave his first interview of the Mormon Stories, and he says this will probably be the last interview I'll ever give. So positive can even come out of conflict if people are willing to have good faith conversations. And shout out to him because he was willing to have a good faith conversation with me, and and that's all I'm striving for, dude, is that. But yeah, that's the thing is that just, I get people like somebody will send me screenshots of comments that were sent about them, and I'm like on a video, and it would be so innocuous. I'm like, okay, like, but you are in this space. You chose to come into this space, so you need to put your big boy pants on and deal with it.
You gotta have
And
some tough skin.
you gotta have some tough skin. The things that have been said about me are horrendous. The
Hmm.
accusations made against me have been disgusting and vile. And I still plod along, and I feel hurt sometimes by it, but I just move on. And it's a very tough space to be in, especially when you're trying to facilitate conversations between warring factions. And sometimes if those conversations go sideways, I become collateral damage, or where they'll attack me, even though if I'm just delivering the message or I'm just trying to facilitate stuff. So it can be hurtful too to be in this neutral space, that I occupy in this world. And but it's not an easy space to be in at all. It can be very stressful at times as well.
Oh, absolutely. No, there's I've said this, if you're gonna podcast about Mormonism, I hope you approach it as a calling, right?
I
I know
consider it, yeah.
you made allusions to that. I definitely felt that way, and I think you have to, right? Because look, you are going to get some pushback. You're going to get some arrows flung your direction. It's just the price of doing business.
Yeah.
And then you got to have some tough skin to be able just to let that. I've told people, look, I'm fine with you insulting me because someday I'm going to publish a book of all the best and wittiest insults. So if you're going to do it, just come with some wit and some humor. Really make it worth my while to read. Don't don't do that halfway. Go all in.
Mhm.
Um, but no, you do have to have some tough skin. Let's wrap up with this one. Where do you think? What's your hopes for the channel?
Um, I feel like the channel, and maybe not everybody's going to agree with this, but I think that I'm in the exact same spot that I was in when I first turned on the camera and did my very first book review. I think my heart's in the same space. I think that if you read my, uh, if you go on my description of my channel, I wrote that before I started filming and doing a channel, but I kind of wrote down, okay, this is what the channel is going to be about. And essentially it is that. I don't feel like I've deviated from what the channel was, where I thought the channel was going to play a role. Now, I had no idea that, look, my goal, if you will, my plans, if you will, was there's this guy named that had a YouTube channel. He's since moved to Missouri, um, called LDS Book Reviews. And this guy had like 200 subscribers. And I thought to myself, well, let me look up and see if Mormon Book Reviews is available. And it was. And then also the domain name. So I got those. And I was like, wow, wouldn't it be great to have a YouTube channel with a couple hundred subscribers and I can just talk about the books in my collection? And even in my very first episode, I said, and maybe I'll even occasionally interview people. Well, very quickly, I realized that it wasn't the book reviews people were interested in. They were interested in the interviews.
Right,
I never interviewed anybody. So if you want to go and see the very first time I ever interviewed somebody, period, was when I had Rick Bennett on of Gospel Tangents.
right.
At that moment, I had no idea if I had any talent for it. And but I did okay, and I was surprised because I had no experience interviewing people. And so where do I see this channel going? I think it continues on the trajectory that it's in, which is to continue to strive to have dialogue, um, be civil. Um, that panel discussion you were on a couple weeks ago, like people have said, no other channel could have put together a panel discussion like that with that group of people. And so I just want to strive to have those conversations, whether they're on camera or off camera, and to continue to um, expose people to ideas. So there's a lot of Latter-day Saints because my largest single group, the people who watch the channel, are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And to hear a feminist perspective on Mother, Heavenly Mother, to hear a fundamentalist perspective on Heavenly Mothers, to hear different voices, they're being exposed to these ideas for the probably for the first time. And so I take great pride, if you will, and it's a real privileged place to be able to put together these unique groups of people with different voices and have people be able to be exposed to different ideas that I think is so more important. I tell people, I said, I am here to challenge your faith, not to hurt your faith, but to strengthen your faith. And challenging can be a good thing. Get the wheels turning, make you start questioning things. Don't just take everything like that one airline pilot. He was just accepting what was being told, and then he picks up a church history book and realizes like this is nothing like I was told,
Right.
and ends up leaving. So I want to help people um, maybe strengthen their shelves. I want people to I had this great. I was actually interviewed by, well, I was on Jim Bennett's program, Inside Out with Ian Wilkes was the main host on that episode, and it was Jim and I talking about the Book of Mormon. And I talk a lot about a lot of different things, different perspectives. Is this a fictional account? Is this an ancient record? Is this a 19th century production? What about the plates? And we talked about it, and we took all these different angles. And afterwards, I was talking to Ian. I said, Ian, I said, what I would like to do is when this episode is released, my hope is that we'll be hearing from people who will say, I was almost out of the church, but now you've given me a way to approach the Book of Mormon that bolsters my faith and is able to keep me in. And that would to
Right.
me be a success story. Um,
Yep.
because I tell people, I said, I don't want somebody to leave the church because of something I said or did on my channel. Because I know what that means. And I got nailed by the Christian apologists for saying that. But they don't they're just using AI and doing quote mining on me. They're not actually doing any research, even though research is in their
Right.
name. Um, what I was saying was if somebody were to leave the church because of something I said or did, I understand what that means. Potential job loss. Maybe they get shunned from their family. Maybe they get divorced. Maybe all this stuff happens because of some statement I said on my channel. No, I don't want to throw somebody's life in that predicament. I
Right.
want them to be informed about this stuff so that they don't have their shelves break. Like I want them to be exposed to all these different ideas and realize that a lot of things that they were told isn't necessarily correct or maybe has been misrepresented to them. And I
Sure.
said, listen, I can still engage the restoration and look at all the warts and flaws and then still walk away with an admiration for Joseph Smith, a love for the Book of Mormon, and more importantly, a love for the people of the restoration. So I guess my goal is for people just to see how much I love and appreciate them. And I want to be a source for them to, I've had Latter-day Saints tell me, I watch your channel because at any moment the Holy Ghost might show up. Well, that's an honor and a privilege to be able to also spiritually affect the lives of people. Originally, this was going to be a secular scholarly channel, but then I had a phone call from a bishop or from an apostle in Independence, Missouri, who started telling me about the Songs of Zion, the supernaturally created hymn book. Made me realize at that moment, like, oh, yes, secular, yes, scholarly, but we also have to make room for the spirit. And so
Yep.
that's what we continue to do here at NPR.
Yep. No, and look, I will say this. I think that there's probably no other religion in Christianity that seems to incorporate everything from doctrine to to almost theocracy at times. And then the history that goes along that is fascinating. So there's no lack of material, right? I know when I started mine, I'm like, look, I go a year, been a success, right? Um, Going now on 4, and you know, it blew up, right? And so I get it. I get exactly what you're talking about. And I've also learned this. If I've made everybody mad at me, chances are I'm probably over the target a little bit, right? When everybody is upset,
Right.
okay, I've poked a button there that
Yeah.
everybody's sensitive to and probably deserves looked at. So, but anyway, it's fun stuff.
Well, Dave, I just want to close with just I want to say something I think that
Yeah.
is important, especially for this particular podcast. Well, first of all, I want to have you back on my channel again, by the way. So you're open, you're
Oh,
invited to come on. So let's plan on
I
doing something
appreciate
soon.
that. You're welcome back here anytime.
I also just want to say that, I tell people, I said, when I spent years, decades really studying Mormonism, history, theology. And so most of what I've learned about Mormonism was before I started this channel. But the one area that I've learned more about is polygamy since I started the channel. And I tell people one of the most important moments of my channel was a Saturday night in which there's was an engagement. Of course, I had been interviewing Benjamin Schaefer,
Yep.
and I found him to be a really pleasant guy. I remember the first time I ever met him, it was just a few months into the channel. He was at the Firm Foundation manning a booth. I'm like, I know who you are. I watched you on Gospel Tangents. And he's like, okay, Steve, he said, just don't tell him that let anybody know that I'm a polygamist. I said, yeah, don't worry. It's our secret. And then that led to us doing a series of interviews. And then that led for there to be a conversation with members of Christ Branch, which of course at the time you were a member of. And I didn't know. It was like they lined them up and just put them in front of me and talked from like a 17-year-old teenage girl to the last plural wife of the founding prophet of the church, who was in her mid to upper 80s, and everybody in between. And I also remember seeing you in the background, this big guy sitting back there, and it seemed like Benjamin was kind of like, somebody else would come in. So, Dave, wait, wait, wait. And then finally you got on there and we had a great conversation. And so I was honored and privileged to have those conversations because I realized that was when I really realized that um, polygamists or fundamentalists are really, truly some of the most wonderful people I've engaged in restoration.
Well, I appreciate that.
And it really opened my eyes. And I think that also led to some great conversations that I've had with, uh, oh, Ann Wild, the
Yep.
first wife of Ogden Kraut. I had Liz Phillips come on a few times to talk about the AUB and her grandfather, Rulon Alred. I've had Ogden Kraut's son come on and talk about some really important stuff, including about the Dream Mine.
Hmm.
And and so it really opened up to me this world that I realized that a lot of the stuff that had been said about your people have been it's libelous to say the least. And I think you guys have been really mistreated unfairly and misrepresented. And so I just want to say that my engagement with you and people in your movement have been a real blessing in my life.
Oh, well, I
And
appreciate
I'll,
that.
I'll forever be grateful to the love that's been extended to me. And I know that many people in the fundamentalist community appreciate um, what I'm doing here too. So I just want to honor you as a people.
Well, I appreciate that. And, I think some of this, it's interesting, right? Because I come to fundamentalism not being a Mormon of any stripe, right? I was baptized into the LDS Church as a young man, um, worked the program there. Um, and so when I come into fundamentalism, it's easy to see that there's a little bit of societal scarring that has happened, right? These are people who have had their kids taken away, and so we, a lot of us weren't necessarily lining up to be public, right? Because, well, we know how that game ends, um, and it's hard to break that down, but I think because of what Warren Jeffs did, um, and look, I mean, I had Warren's son on the program, right? Who found his way back to the faith despite everything his dad had done.
Wow.
Um, they, he did some damage, right? But I do believe that we're in a time now where, quite frankly, our voices are kind of needed, right? Not mine, but our voices collectively.
Hmm.
Because I do think that it's interesting. I think the LDS Church especially is in a place where you almost need a little bit of fundamentalism in there to address some of these topics that, quite frankly, seem to have been forgotten by all but scholars now, right? The things that scholars tend to know, um, a lot of them are everyday things that fundamentalists know,
Right.
right? Things like women in the priesthood, heavenly mother, those are things we all have answers on if someone wants that answer. It's just it's an interesting time, and I think our voices are needed now more than ever. But
Yeah.
it come with its own challenges, and so venues like yours has allowed that message to be out that, hey, we're not all Warren Jeffs, right?
Yes, I agree. Yep. Yep. I
I,
certainly
I think
I certainly
I
hope
think
that that's
that was huge. So
yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And yeah, I really feel like that's, I wouldn't have imagined when I was engaged in the community of Christ that I would then be talking to all these fundamentalists. It's amazing the diversity within the movement and all that. And so, yeah, it's been a real privilege to be in the space. I've told people I feel like God said, well, no, God never said this, but I said this myself. I said, maybe I'm only going to do this for a season. Maybe the
mhm.
door will be shut. So I don't know how much longer this goes. I hope that it continues. I hope I do this for the rest of my life. But if God tells me it's time to move on, then I'll move on. But
Yeah,
I hope to be a voice in this world, and I hope to continue to give voice to the voiceless. When a lot of people don't, I can book any big name I want, but I'm more interested in having people on that nobody's ever heard of to give their story and
right.
to give their position, their views on things. That to me, I think is much more. I get more joy in that than more than
Yeah,
anything.
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, bro, it was fun. We should do it
It's
again.
great. Yeah, this is fun. Thanks. I love this kind of stuff. I love open-ended conversations, and this was
Me
fun.
too.
So thank you so much for having me on today.
You bet. Let's do it again. Stick around
Sounds
for
fun.
5 minutes. Bye, everybody.